What would you do if the most feared CEO in Korea locked eyes with you across a crowded room, and that single glance made him smile for the first time in 20 years? No one knew why Kim Seojin stopped speaking. Some whispered about a massacre that destroyed his family when he was barely 18. Others claimed the trauma was so horrific it sealed his voice forever. For 2 decades, he ruled Seoul's underground empire without uttering a single word, communicating only through written commands and lethal silence. Until Adana Brooke, a broke motor-mouth economics graduate, crashed a business seminar she had no business attending and couldn't stop talking. She should have been thrown out for trespassing. Instead, he offered her a position that would change everything. Become his strategic consultant, and he'd pay her more money than she'd ever imagined. She said yes. Big mistake. Because Adana is about to discover that some silences hide massacres, and making a monster feel again might cost her everything, including her life. Because what happens next is insane. Before we get into how a silent king falls dangerously in love with the one woman who won't shut up, I need you to do something for me right now. Smash that subscribe button and turn on all notifications, because this story gets darker, more obsessive, and more dangerous with every single chapter. And you do not want to miss what Seojin does when rival syndicates try to kill Adana to destroy him. Then, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and whether you'd accept a job from a man who hasn't spoken in 20 years. I read every single comment, and I want to know if you're team take the money or team run for your life. Do it now, then let's get back to how Adana just walked straight into the dragon's lair. Done? Good. Now let's dive in. Adana Brooke had exactly $127 in her bank account when she made the worst decision of her life. She talked her way into the Celestial Grand Hotel's executive business seminar, a high-profile event where corporate Korea's elite discussed international trade policy over champagne that cost more than her rent. A place where broke foreign graduates didn't belong unless they had death wishes or connections to people who made death wishes disappear. The Celestial wasn't just a luxury hotel, it was neutral ground for Seoul's power players, where legitimate business empires met the underground organizations that actually ran the city. The top 3 floors were permanently reserved for the Baeko Syndicate, a ruthlessly efficient criminal network that controlled everything from shipping ports to government contracts. Adana didn't care about any of that. She cared about the networking opportunities, the free high-end refreshments, and the slim chance that someone in that room might finally see past her 23 rejected job applications and recognize what her MIT-level brain could do. At 25 years old, with a degree in international economics that nobody wanted and a mouth that wouldn't stay shut even when it should, she'd learned that sometimes survival meant faking confidence in rooms where you absolutely didn't belong. The seminar was everything she expected, sleek, intimidating, and filled with powerful people in suits that cost more than her entire education. Adana wore her best thrifted blazer, styled her hair in a polished, slicked-back look, and told herself to observe quietly and network strategically for once in her life. That plan lasted exactly 11 minutes. The moderator opened the floor for discussion on emerging markets in Southeast Asia, and someone, a silver-haired executive with the kind of voice that expected agreement, made a completely inaccurate statement about currency stabilization that made her entire economics degree scream in protest. Before she could stop herself, her hand shot up. "Actually, that's not quite accurate," she heard herself say, her voice cutting through the polite murmurs. "The data from the last fiscal quarter shows the opposite trend, and if you factor in the IMF's revised projections..." And then she was off, words tumbling out in the passionate, rapid-fire way they always did when she got excited about an idea. She cited studies, challenged assumptions, gestured animatedly with her hands as she painted economic models in the air, completely forgetting that she was an uninvited guest, contradicting someone who probably had more power in his little finger than she'd ever have in her entire life. The room had gone quiet, but not the uncomfortable kind. The interested kind. The kind where people actually leaned forward to hear what she was saying. That's when she felt it. A gaze. Heavy, focused, burning into the side of her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She turned her head mid-sentence, and that's when she saw him. In the back corner of the room, partially hidden in shadow, sat a man who looked like he'd been carved from ice and violence, tall even while seated, wearing a black suit so perfectly tailored it looked like a second skin. Sharp, aristocratic features that could have belonged to royalty if not for the cold brutality in every line of his face, and a dragon tattoo that curved from behind his right ear down his neck, its intricate scales visible above his collar, a mark of something ancient and dangerous. But it was his eyes that stopped her mid-word. Dark brown, penetrating, absolutely unreadable, fixed on her face with the kind of focus that made her feel like he was looking through her skin straight into her soul. And then, impossible, terrifying, mesmerizing, the corner of his mouth lifted. Not a full smile, just the ghost of one, barely there, but enough to transform his entire face from something frozen into something almost human. The man beside him, clearly an assistant, looked at his boss with an expression of pure shock, as if he'd just witnessed a miracle or a catastrophe, he couldn't tell which. Adana's brain, which had been running at full speed, stuttered and stopped. Her sentence hung unfinished in the air. Every instinct she had, the ones she usually ignored, were screaming that she'd just made eye contact with the most dangerous person in the room. She managed to finish her point, stumbling slightly over words that usually came so easily, hyper-aware of those dark eyes that never left her face. When the moderator thanked her for her passionate contribution and moved the discussion forward, she sank into her chair, heart pounding. She told herself to leave, to slip out during the next break and forget this ever happened. She didn't get the chance. When the seminar ended and the crowd dispersed toward the networking reception, she found herself intercepted by two men in immaculate suits who appeared on either side of her like shadows made solid. "Ms. Brooke," one said in perfect English, his tone polite but absolutely inflexible. "Mr. Kim requests your presence. This way, please." It wasn't a request. The hand that didn't quite touch her elbow made that clear. "Wait, I think there's been a mistake," she started, her mouth running on autopilot the way it always did when she was nervous. "I'm not actually registered for this event. I kind of just walked in, which I know sounds bad, but I promise I wasn't trying to cause any trouble. I just really needed to network and—" "Mr. Kim is waiting," the man repeated. And something in his voice made her understand that refusing wasn't an option that would end well for her. They led her through corridors that grew progressively quieter and more expensive, past security checkpoints where guards stepped aside without question, up a private elevator that required a fingerprint scan. When the doors opened, she stepped into a penthouse office that looked like it belonged in an architectural magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Seoul's glittering skyline. Minimalist furniture in blacks and grays. Art on the walls that was probably worth more than she'd earn in a lifetime. And standing by the window, backlit by the city lights, was the man with the dragon tattoo. He turned when she entered, and up close, he was even more devastating. Taller than she'd realized, at least 6'1", with a presence that filled the entire room despite his absolute stillness. Those dark eyes found hers again, and she felt that same electric shock of connection. He gestured to a chair across from a sleek black desk. She sat, not because she wanted to, but because her knees had gone unreliable. The assistant who'd accompanied her stepped forward with a tablet and a small notepad. "Mr. Kim would like to make you an offer," he said, and there was something almost apologetic in his tone, as if he knew how insane this was about to sound. The man, Mr. Kim, pulled out a fountain pen that probably cost more than her laptop and wrote something in swift, elegant Korean characters. The assistant read it, then looked at Adana with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Mr. Kim would like to offer you a position as his strategic consultant. The salary would be $500 million per year, with housing provided, security detail included, and immediate start date. Adana's brain did the math automatically. That was over $375,000 USD. More money than she'd ever imagined earning. Enough to pay off her student loans, send money to her parents, actually live instead of just survive. She started, but Mr. Kim was writing again. The assistant cleared his throat. He says your analysis during the seminar demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking his organization needs. Your ability to see patterns others miss, to articulate complex ideas rapidly and convincingly, these are valuable skills. Mr. Kim's eyes hadn't left her face. She felt like a specimen under glass, being examined and evaluated in ways she couldn't begin to understand. What kind of organization? She asked, proud that her voice only shook a little. What would I actually be doing? More writing. The assistant hesitated before translating. Attending meetings, providing analysis, speaking on his behalf when necessary. Something about the way he said it made her understand what wasn't being said. This wasn't a normal corporate position. The security, the private elevator, the way everyone they'd passed had looked at Mr. Kim with fear and respect in equal measure. You want me to work for... She trailed off, not sure how to finish that sentence without potentially getting herself killed. Mr. Kim's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those dark eyes. Amusement? Respect that she'd figured it out? He wrote one more line. The assistant read it and actually smiled, just slightly. He says, "You're either very brave or very foolish. He hasn't decided which. Either way, you'll be interesting." Adana should have said no. Should have stood up, walked out, and booked the first flight back to the United States, where the worst thing that could happen to her was another job rejection. Instead, she heard herself say, "When do I start?" And Kim So-jin, the silent king of Seoul's underworld, the man who hadn't spoken in 20 years, smiled at her for the second time. She had no idea that smile would change everything, that it meant she'd just become the most dangerous man in Korea's greatest weakness, or that learning to hear what he couldn't say would save both their lives. Adana's new apartment was nothing like the one she'd left behind. It was a minimalist's dream, tucked away in the quiet, secure district near Seo-jin's headquarters. From the high windows, she could see a patch of green, a rare sight in the city, but it wasn't the view that captured her attention. It was the silence. The hum of the outside world felt muffled, distant, like a different realm. Inside, everything was designed to be efficient. Sleek furniture, muted colors, no unnecessary decor. It was in sharp contrast to the buzz of city life she'd grown used to. She wasn't entirely alone, though. Seo-jin had made sure of that. His presence was a constant, even when he wasn't physically in the room. The consulting work she had agreed to was something that seemed as elusive as the work itself. Most of her days were spent attending meetings, briefings, debriefings, strategy sessions, and often just waiting. She spoke when she needed to, but mostly she was there to observe and watch. Seo-jin watched her closely too. His sharp, unreadable gaze would linger on her from across the table, his lips tight, his posture rigid. In meetings, where the conversations usually spun in rapid, tactical circles, Adana began to notice something strange. While everyone else was caught up in words, So-jin said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was a language all its own, one that Adana quickly began to decipher. It started with the small things, the subtle movements of his hands or the flicker of an eyebrow that seemed to carry weight. She began to notice when his gaze softened, when it became intense, when his jaw clenched. It was as though his body was a code, a series of small but telling signs that spoke volumes without a single word. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, trying to make sense of the silence that enveloped him. But the more she watched, the more certain she became. There was an entire vocabulary in Seo-jin's silence, and she was determined to learn it. Sometimes, it was the smallest gesture that told her everything. A slight tilt of his head when someone said something he found amusing, a barely perceptible narrowing of his eyes when something displeased him. Each gesture had its meaning, but only if you were paying attention. And she was learning to pay attention, to train herself to read the language in his stillness. The written commands were another part of the puzzle. Seo-jin would leave short notes for her, always typed, always precise. "Stay out of sight," one would say. "Make contact," another would read. They were never long, just fragments of instructions, but they were enough. It was as if he was guiding her through the fog of his silence, leading her with these cryptic messages. She was beginning to understand that silence, for him, wasn't the absence of communication. It was the foundation of it. Some days, she would find herself walking through the halls of his headquarters, feeling like a shadow. The building itself was like a living organism, always shifting, always watching. Seo-jin's presence was felt everywhere, even when he wasn't physically there. The guards, the assistants, even the janitorial staff, everyone knew their place in his world, and everyone moved with a silent precision that matched his own. She had to fit into that rhythm too, without disrupting the flow. If she wasn't careful, she would be swallowed by the quiet. In those rare moments when Seo-jin did speak, his words were measured and deliberate, but they weren't for her. Not always. He would direct questions to others, make pointed remarks, but never to her. It was as though his silence was a protective barrier, one that kept her at arm's length, safe but distant. Yet, even in his silence, there were moments of connection. When a task was completed well or a strategy unfolded just as he had planned, she would catch a flash of something, maybe a slight nod, or the briefest of smiles. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was his way of acknowledging her, of telling her that she had done well. There was a language in those brief interactions, too, one she was learning to understand. The absence of words had its own rhythm, its own pace, and in time, she would master it as completely as she had mastered language itself. She found herself becoming more attuned to the unspoken rules of the space around her. The tension in the air when Seo-jin's focus shifted, the barely perceptible change in his posture when a deal was close to being made. Even the smallest flicker of his expression, those subtle hints, told her everything she needed to know. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of meaning, of unspoken commands and intentions. And she was learning to listen. The longer she stayed, the more she realized that Seo-jin's world was one built entirely on this language. Words, when they came, were superfluous. Everything important was conveyed in what wasn't said, in the spaces between, in the glances and gestures that passed unnoticed by most, but not by her. She had become a student of silence, and the more she learned, the more she understood how deeply connected she was becoming to Seo-jin's way of thinking. It wasn't just about interpreting his silence, it was about becoming fluent in it, and the more fluent she became, the more she felt herself blending into his world, quiet, precise, and full of unspoken power. The tension in the room was thick enough to suffocate anyone who wasn't used to the game. The hum of electricity was so heavy it practically buzzed in the air, curling around the silence like smoke. Adana stood with her back straight, arms crossed and eyes narrowed, not even flinching as the rival gang's leader, a hulking man named Franco, leaned in closer, his breath hot against her cheek. The men around them were all lined up, posture stiff, hands close to their weapons. The atmosphere was one that could snap in an instant, a live wire of barely contained violence. "You're trying to buy us out, but you have no idea what you're getting into." Franco's voice was low, menacing, his words carrying the weight of years spent making people obey him with fear. Adana didn't blink. She didn't flinch. "Funny, that's exactly what I was thinking about you." Her voice was steady, unyielding, and as she spoke, she watched the way his gaze flickered for just a moment, just long enough to show that she had struck a nerve. "You think you can intimidate people with threats, but the only thing you're doing is proving that you're scared. You've got nothing but empty words and that stupid, ugly reputation. So if you think that's going to make me quake in my boots, then you really are as stupid as you look." The room went dead silent. Every muscle in Sojin's body went still, his dark eyes studying her, unreadable. Around them, his men were tense, barely breathing, unsure if she was about to be turned into a bloodstain on the floor. Franco didn't react right away. His glare could have burned through steel, but Adana didn't look away. She didn't move. She just held his gaze, waiting for him to do something, anything, to prove that he wasn't just all talk. That was the thing. Franco wasn't just a hothead. He had the respect of people who feared him, people who believed his brand of violence was the only language that mattered. But she could see the cracks in his armor. She knew how to talk to him like she would anyone else. Finally, the man smirked, clearly annoyed. "You're trying to provoke me, girl. It's not going to work." Adana didn't hesitate. "No, Franco, I'm calling you out. You're all posturing, just like your little gang over there." She waved a hand dismissively toward the men behind him. "You think you're tough because you wave around guns and make threats, but the only real power you've got is in the way people fear you, and that only lasts as long as you keep proving that fear's justified, doesn't it?" For a long moment, Franco said nothing, his fists clenching at his sides. But then, to everyone's surprise, he barked out a laugh, though it was more a growl than anything else. "I'll give you that, girl," he muttered. "But you'll learn quick enough that this isn't a game you can talk your way out of." Adana tilted her head slightly, the edge of a smile pulling at the corner of her lips. "Maybe I'll just stick around long enough to make you realize your little empire's built on sand." Sojin, standing a few feet behind her, was the only one who seemed to relax, his shoulders finally releasing the tension they'd been carrying since the negotiation started. He let out a quiet chuckle, and for the first time, it wasn't a cold, calculated sound. It was something warmer, more genuine, though still soft enough that no one else noticed. His men, though, caught the shift. Their leader was laughing, not with the mocking contempt he usually reserved for the world, but with an almost affectionate amusement. The moment passed, but the weight that had been hanging over the room shifted. Franco backed down, muttering something about this not being over, but Adana could see the fear in his eyes now. His hands weren't as steady as before. That was what she'd done. She'd exposed him for the pretender he was. Later that evening, after the tense standoff had dissolved into an uneasy truce, Seojin found her alone by the balcony of the penthouse. The city lights flickered below, casting shadows on the darkened streets. "You know?" Seojin's voice broke the silence, low and even. "You've got some serious guts, Adana." She glanced over at him, arching a brow. "Or maybe I'm just really good at pissing people off." Sojin chuckled again, his amusement still lingering in the air between them. It was different, a change in the atmosphere that made her wonder if he was starting to see her as more than just a liability, more than just a pawn in whatever game he was playing. But he didn't elaborate further. Instead, he stepped toward her, his gaze locking onto hers for a moment longer than necessary. Then, from his coat pocket, he pulled out a small folded piece of paper, one she hadn't noticed him carrying earlier. "I thought you should have this," he said, holding it out to her. Adana took it, unfolding the note carefully. It was written in his precise, elegant script. "You're either very brave or very foolish. I haven't decided which." A smile tugged at her lips as she met his gaze. "Well, you're not the only one with questions, Seojin," she said, her voice playful. But there was something deeper in the words, something unspoken. Seojin didn't respond right away, but his eyes softened, just slightly. He took a step back, leaving her with the note, and the city lights continued to flicker below. He didn't say anything more that night, but there was something in the way he looked at her. Something that felt like an answer, though neither of them were ready to say it out loud yet. Adana was still processing the last few days when the knock on her door came, sharp and insistent. She opened it to find Park Min-ho standing there, his expression unreadable, a slight tension in his shoulders. His reputation preceded him. Seojin's loyal lieutenant, a man known for his cold efficiency and unwavering loyalty. But in that moment, his presence felt different. It was more than just the usual quiet strength. There was something more dangerous in the air. "You need to come with me," he said, voice low, his eyes scanning the hallway behind her as though making sure no one could overhear them. Adana didn't question him. She grabbed her coat and followed, her heart already starting to race. Minho led her through the dimly lit corridors of their building, past a few empty rooms, until they reached a small, nondescript office at the back. The door clicked shut behind them, and Minho turned to face her, his gaze intense. "Sit down," he instructed, his tone now firmer. Adana obeyed, her unease growing. There was something in his eyes, something that warned her this wasn't a casual conversation. It wasn't just about business. "Seojin's losing control," Minho said bluntly, pacing in front of her as he spoke. "And you're making it worse." Adana blinked, the words catching her off guard. "What are you talking about?" "You," he said, his voice cold, almost like a reprimand. "You've been pulling him in different directions. You're distracting him, weakening him. And in our world, weakness gets people killed. That's the harsh reality, Adana." She swallowed hard, trying to digest what he was saying. Minho had always been straightforward, but this felt personal. She tried to recall all her interactions with Seojin, the long meetings, the arguments, the moments when she thought she was helping him, when she thought they were making progress. Had she been wrong? Had she really been a distraction, a liability? "He's not the man he used to be," Minho continued, stepping closer, his voice dropping lower. "I've been watching him slip, Adana. And I don't need you to tell me you're helping him. We both know the truth. Every time you come around, it takes longer for him to make decisions. He second-guesses everything. That's not a leader. That's a liability." Adana felt a chill spread through her veins. She had known Seojin was different lately. He'd been distant, almost detached, as if the weight of everything was finally starting to take its toll. But hearing it from Minho, seeing the brutal truth in his eyes, it made her stomach drop. "I didn't mean to," she began, but Minho cut her off. "Stop," he said, his voice sharp. "Don't try to justify it. We both know why you're here. You think you're helping him by being close to him, but you're not. You're making it worse. And now, you need to understand something." Adana's heart hammered in her chest. "What?" Minho took a step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "If you really care about Seojin, if you really want to help him, you need to leave him. Walk away. Let him stand on his own. Because as long as you're here, as long as you're in his life like this, he won't be able to function. And if he can't function, if he keeps stumbling and second-guessing, we're all dead. Do you understand that?" The words hit her like a slap. She had never considered the full consequences of her presence, the way it might be unraveling everything Seojin had built. The weight of his power, his influence. It had always seemed so solid, so unshakable. But now, Minho's words were starting to make sense. Seo-jin wasn't the same man anymore, and maybe, just maybe, she was a part of that change. For a long moment she sat in silence, her mind racing. Her fingers gripped the edge of the chair as she fought to keep her composure. She knew what she had to do, even if it terrified her. She had to let go. She had to walk away. But when she stood to leave, Minho's hand shot out, catching her arm. His grip was tight, unyielding. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Adana froze, looking up at him in confusion. "What? You think you can just leave?" Minho's face twisted with a strange, almost bitter smile. "No, you're not going anywhere. You're part of this now. You always have been." His hand released her arm, but there was something in his gaze that made her blood run cold. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a stack of paper, handing it to her with a quiet intensity. "You need to read this," he said. Adana took the papers, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped through the pages. It was a collection of handwritten notes, desperate, pleading. She recognized Seo-jin's handwriting, the familiar loop of his letters, but the words were different. They were filled with an obsession she hadn't seen before. "I can't live without you," one page read. "I'll lose everything if you leave me." Each page was more desperate than the last, a window into the madness that had been simmering beneath Seo-jin's calm exterior. It was a warning, not just to her, but to anyone who dared to challenge him. The realization hit her with a sickening clarity. Seo-jin wasn't just slipping, he was already gone. Her stomach turned, the weight of Minho's words settling on her chest like a boulder. She understood now. She wasn't just in danger because of Seo-jin's weakness. She was in danger because Seo-jin was obsessed with her in ways she hadn't fully grasped, and walking away wasn't an option. Not anymore. Adana woke to a dimly lit hospital room, the soft hum of machines around her a steady reminder that she was still alive. The sharp, sterile scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, mixing with the faint smell of blood that she couldn't shake off. Her body felt heavy, bruised, as if she'd been beaten into submission by something far larger and stronger than herself. But it wasn't the physical pain that lingered in her mind. It was the memory of the gunshot, the blur of chaos, the confusion of realizing she had been the real target all along. She blinked, trying to gather her thoughts, her vision still foggy. The world felt distant, muted. As the fog in her head started to lift, her eyes landed on him. Seo-jin. He was sitting in the corner of the room, his back slightly hunched as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. His hands trembled slightly as they rested on his knees, and his jaw was clenched tightly, but she could see the way his eyes, those piercing eyes that usually held so much control, flickered with a kind of vulnerability she had never seen before. Adana's heart gave a sharp tug, something she wasn't prepared for. The man who had built his empire with bloodshed, the ruthless crime lord who had kept everyone at arm's length, was staring at her now with something she couldn't quite place. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by an unspoken fear that gripped him in a way she had never imagined. His gaze locked onto hers as her eyelids fluttered open, and in that moment, time seemed to pause. For a brief second, she saw him not as the leader of a dangerous syndicate, not as the man who had walked into her life with calculated intentions, but as someone just human, someone who had been terrified of losing her. She took a shallow breath, the sound of it barely audible, but enough to break the tension that had held him in place. His eyes shifted immediately, now focused intently on her face, his hand reaching out tentatively. "Adana," he whispered, his voice raw, fragile in a way she'd never heard before. The familiar coldness that usually coated his tone was gone, replaced by something softer, something almost pleading. He slowly cupped her face with his trembling hand, the touch so delicate, so unsure, as if he were afraid she might shatter beneath his fingertips. You're alive." The words hung in the air like a confession. For a man who dealt in certainty, who made ruthless decisions without hesitation, this raw admission of fear was something she hadn't expected. Adana felt her heart ache. The pain from the bullet wound in her side suddenly a distant memory compared to the ache she felt from this moment. She hadn't known he was capable of feeling this much. She hadn't known he cared so much. Her eyes fluttered closed for a moment as she steadied herself, her chest rising and falling in quick succession. "Why?" she asked softly, her voice rough from the exertion of speaking. She didn't need to ask who had been behind the attempt on her life. She knew it had been meant for him. But this question, this raw and vulnerable question, was about something deeper, something that had been brewing between them since their paths had first crossed. Why was he here? Why wasn't he just sending someone to deal with her injury from a distance and keeping his distance from her as he always did? His hand lingered against her cheek, his thumb grazing the tender skin, and he finally spoke again, his voice low. "Because if you had died, I wouldn't have been able to live with myself." The words struck her like a lightning bolt, sending a shock through her chest. She had heard Seo-jin speak of power, of control, of maintaining order in his world, but never of regret, never of a weakness like this. Adana's eyes widened. She wanted to say something, to make sense of the twisted knot of emotions that had suddenly unfurled inside her. But her throat tightened as the realization hit her with full force. He wasn't here because of obligation. It wasn't duty. It wasn't business. He was here because he was afraid. He was afraid of losing her. She couldn't help it. She reached up, her hand weak from the drug still coursing through her veins. But she still managed to wrap her fingers around his wrist. His pulse thudded under her touch, frantic and unsteady, as though the mere act of her contact brought some kind of relief. She gently pulled his hand away from her face, bringing it to her chest, over her heart. It was a gesture of reassurance, a simple way to show him she was alive, that he had her in this moment. "I'm here, Seo-jin," she whispered, her voice barely audible but steady, grounded. "I'm still here." The way he looked at her then, his eyes soft but searching, desperate for confirmation that she meant it, sent a shiver down her spine. He didn't speak for a long time, just watched her, as though he were memorizing the contours of her face, the way she breathed, the rise and fall of her chest. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice cracking with something he rarely allowed anyone to hear. "I thought I lost you." Adana didn't know how to respond to that. She didn't know what kind of answer could settle the turbulence in his voice. The man who had terrified her so many times with his cold, calculated decisions was broken in front of her, and for the first time she saw the fear that drove him. He was just a man, after all. A man who had been shaped by violence, by betrayal, by loss, and somehow, despite everything, she found herself choosing to stay. Not because she had to, but because in that moment, with his trembling hand still resting gently against her skin, she realized she didn't want to leave. She understood now, perhaps for the first time, that there was more to Seo-jin than the crime lord, more to him than the monster he portrayed, and maybe there was a part of her that needed him too. The ropes that bound her wrists were tight, leaving red welts where they dug into her skin. Adana shifted slightly, trying to find a more comfortable position on the cold stone floor of the dimly lit room. Her heart pounded in her chest as her eyes scanned the darkened corners, searching for any hint of movement. The silence pressed in around her, thick and suffocating. It had been hours, maybe more, since she had been taken. Her thoughts raced, her mind unwilling to settle on anything for too long. She had to find a way out, but the reality was she had no idea where she was or how to escape. The door creaked open, breaking the stillness, and the woman who entered moved with the grace of someone used to commanding attention. Lee Yuna, the head of the Chongryong Triad. Her presence was as cold as it was calculating, a woman who had no tolerance for weakness, no room for softness. The weight of her gaze seemed to press down on Adana like a physical force. "You must be wondering why you're here," Yuna said, her voice smooth, devoid of any real emotion. She paced slowly around the room, her steps deliberate. "I suppose it's only fair that I explain." Adana's heart skipped. She didn't answer. What could she say? Pleading for mercy would get her nowhere with this woman. Yuna stopped in front of her, her sharp eyes studying Adana as if she were some rare, curious creature. "You're here to draw him out, aren't you? To make him choose between his empire and you." The words hit harder than they should have. Sojin. Her mind immediately went to him, the image of his face, the warmth in his eyes when they'd shared a rare, quiet moment together. The way his lips had curled into that fleeting smile, one that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, there was something soft inside the man who had brought her here. But now Yuna's words rang in her ears, and she felt a growing unease deep in her bones. "You think he'll come for you?" Yuna asked, her eyes narrowing, as if the idea of Seojin's attachment to her was something amusing. "You really don't understand, do you? You think this is about love. You think you matter to him." Her voice hardened, a sharpness creeping into it that made the room feel even colder. Yuna leaned closer, her face now inches from Adana's. "Let me tell you something. Sojin is not the man you think he is. He's a monster in a carefully tailored suit." Adana felt a pang of fear run through her, but she refused to let it show. She met Yuna's gaze, her defiance a weak shield against the suffocating truth that was slowly creeping in. "I don't believe you," Adana said, the words coming out with more force than she had expected. Yuna smiled, a slow, cruel curve of her lips. "You will, in time." With a flick of her wrist, Yuna signaled to one of the men who had been silently watching from the corner. He stepped forward, holding a small tablet in his hands. The screen flickered to life, and images flashed across it. Grainy, shaky footage at first, but soon clearer as the camera zoomed in. Adana's breath hitched in her throat as she watched the images unfold on the screen. The familiar streets of the city, the gleaming towers of the wealthy district. But then it shifted. The camera focused on a house, Seojin's childhood home. It was a modest, quiet place, nothing like the sprawling estate he now owned. But what followed was anything but peaceful. Adana's heart dropped as the video revealed the brutal assault. A group of men, armed and ruthless, storming into the home. Sojin, a child barely more than 10, watching in silent horror as his family was slaughtered before his eyes. The camera lingered on the boy, frozen in the doorway, a look of pure terror on his face, but no sound. Nothing but the violence and chaos surrounding him. Yuna's voice cut through the silence, low and deliberate. That was Seojin's family, his mother, his father, his little sister, all of them dead. His empire wasn't built on ambition, it was built on revenge. And he's never looked back. Adana felt a cold sweat break out along her skin. The weight of Yuna's words was unbearable. Seojin, the man she had come to care for, had built everything from the ashes of his past, from the blood of his family. His rise to power wasn't just about wealth or influence, it was about obliterating anyone who dared cross him. Mercy? It was a luxury he couldn't afford. The images on the screen faded, but the image of young Seojin standing alone in the doorway haunted her. "You think he'll save you?" Yuna's voice came again, steady and unfeeling. You think he'll be the hero? He doesn't know how to save anyone, least of all himself. He is a king who has never known love, and he will never be able to give it to you. Adana's mind raced. The man she had begun to fall for, the one whose touch had made her feel like she wasn't so alone in the world, was a product of unimaginable pain and violence. He had shaped himself into this king, a silent ruler who had learned to drown his emotions beneath layers of cold calculation. She thought of the moments they had shared, the tenderness in his eyes, the way he held her like she was something fragile, something worth protecting. But now she wasn't so sure. The man who had stood before her, offering his heart in fragments, might not have any heart left to give. A tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, angry at herself for letting this crack in her armor show. Yuna watched her with a certain satisfaction, as though she knew exactly what the younger woman was feeling. You're not going to like what you learn about him, Yuna said, almost gently. But you will learn it. You will see the monster, just as I have, and when you do, you'll understand why I had to do this. Adana felt a chill settle deep in her bones. The trap had already been set, and Sojin was walking right into it. The question was, would he still be the man she thought she knew when he came for her? Or would he too be consumed by the darkness of his past? Seojin's boots echoed down the stone hallway of Yuna's compound, the sound sharp, relentless. He hadn't expected it to feel so familiar. For 20 years he had been away, but everything here still smelled the same, an odd mix of cold metal and dust, a place that had never been quite alive but never quite dead either. He hadn't thought of this place in a long time, not like this, not with the sharpness of purpose that now drove his every step. His hand tightened on the hilt of his weapon as he reached the door at the end of the hall. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. There was no time for formalities. The door, already cracked, gave way with the force of his shoulder. Inside, the tension in the room snapped like a taut wire, each person in the dimly lit space freezing at his sudden presence. A dozen faces turned toward him, mostly men, a few women, all hardened, their eyes wide with surprise. But it wasn't them that Sojin was focused on. His gaze immediately locked on the figure standing across the room, her back to him, hands trembling as she held a gun to Adana's head. The sight of her, Adana, brought everything crashing back. Her silhouette, once so familiar, now seemed foreign, like a ghost he had never quite let go of. And yet, in this moment, he knew he could never turn away from her again. Adana's eyes were shut tight, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She was still alive, but it wasn't just her that had suffered all these years. He saw it in her body, in the way she held herself, careful, cautious, like every movement might bring another blow. The gun at her head didn't matter. It was the years, the loss, the silence between them that had done the real damage. He had been too late, and still, there she was, like some unyielding part of his past he hadn't been able to erase, no matter how far he had run, no matter how much he had tried to forget. A figure to the side, Yuna, stood still as stone, watching with calculated eyes. She hadn't expected him to show up this way, and yet there was a faint, almost imperceptible smirk on her face. She had always been too sure of herself, too comfortable in her power, but there was something in her expression now, perhaps recognition, or maybe the first stirrings of fear. She understood that Sojin had broken her game, even before he said a word. For a long moment, no one moved. The stillness in the air was thick with something heavy, something waiting. Seojin's hand hovered by his weapon, but his mind wasn't on the fight that was coming. It was on the woman in front of him. His throat tightened, and he fought the sting in his eyes. No, this wasn't about him. This was about the one person in the world who had always been his equal, the one person who had ever really known him. The silence stretched on, and then, finally, his lips parted, though they felt stiff and cracked, unused for far too long. His voice was broken, a rasp that hadn't been heard in decades. "Adana." The single word came out rough, hoarse, but it was unmistakable. It cut through the room like a blade. It didn't matter that it was shaky, that it was jagged with emotion. That one name, that one word, her name, carried the weight of 2 decades, of silence, of everything they had both lost. Everything shifted then, in that moment. The air felt thinner, like the balance of power had suddenly tilted, just enough to make everyone in the room aware of it. It was as if the entire universe had held its breath for 20 years, waiting for this one moment to release it. Yuna's eyes flickered, and she took a half-step back. She hadn't anticipated this. Sojin's presence, yes, but not the way he commanded it. Not with a voice that could bring the dead back to life. Her fingers twitched around the gun, but she didn't raise it any higher. There was something in Seo-jin's posture now that made her hesitate. Something dangerous, something ancient that she didn't fully understand. She had thought herself in control, but for the first time she wasn't so sure. Adana's eyes opened, slowly, as though she had been unsure whether she could trust the sound of his voice. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, her lips parted as if she might speak, but the words wouldn't come. There were no words left for them anymore. Not after everything. Seo-jin took a step forward, every movement deliberate, as though the weight of the past 20 years had shackled his body to the ground. He didn't care about the gun anymore. He didn't care about the people around them. He only cared about getting to her. The stillness stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but it didn't matter. Seo-jin was no longer the man who had run. He was here now, and that was all that mattered. And as he reached out, the space between them closing, his voice cracked again, but this time, it was steady. "I'm here." It was enough. It would have to be. The days after Yuna's fall felt heavy, like the air was thick with the remnants of a storm that had already passed. Seo-jin had done what she had set out to do. Yuna's organization was no more. Its web of influence unraveled in a sudden, brutal surge of power. But with that victory came an unsettling stillness. There was no celebration, no victorious shouting or parades. It was all business as usual now, but everyone knew something had shifted in the very core of the syndicate. Despite the calm, change was inevitable. Park Min-ho, one of the senior members, was the first to voice the unspoken sentiment that had been creeping through the ranks. He didn't waste time. He had the sharpness of a man who saw every opportunity and acted swiftly, without hesitation. The coup was already in motion by the time he had gathered his supporters. His argument was simple, ruthless, and clear. A boss who speaks too much, a boss who shows vulnerability, was a boss who could not lead. Min-ho had never been the quiet type. His power came from his decisiveness, from his ability to seize the moment and crush whatever or whoever stood in his way. But Seo-jin was different. She had spoken when she didn't have to, when silence would have preserved her status and authority. Min-ho saw that as a weakness. He believed that a true leader didn't need to explain themselves. They commanded without question, without doubt. To show anything else was to open the door for others to challenge you, to see cracks in the armor. It was all so calculated, so carefully planned. Min-ho had bided his time, watching for the moment when Seo-jin's decision to speak would be her undoing. He had gathered enough support to strike, and he knew he could do it swiftly. But there was a problem. The room was full of more than just Seo-jin's enemies. There were those who believed in her, who saw her not as a symbol of weakness, but as someone who had chosen to take a stand, to be transparent when so many before her had hidden behind shadows. Among them was Adana, who had not been swayed by the undercurrents of revolt. She saw beyond the whispers, beyond Minho's clever manipulation. She knew that Seojin's silence, her refusal to speak until now, had been deliberate. It was a calculated power move, a declaration of strength in a world where silence often meant compliance or fear. The moment Seojin chose to speak, she had chosen to break that silence not out of fear, but out of a need to control her destiny, to shape the narrative of her leadership. The syndicate gathered, tensions thick in the air. It was clear the split was coming. The question wasn't if, but when. Adana stood at the front of the room, her posture unwavering as the murmurs of dissent echoed off the walls. She didn't need to say much, but what she said carried a weight that made even the most hardened members pause. "The silence you speak of," Adana began, her voice calm but carrying through the room with an undeniable authority, "is not weakness, it's power." Seojin chose to speak not because she was forced, not because of any flaw in her leadership, but because she knew what that moment would mean. She understood the game better than anyone in this room. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. The room was silent now, a few of Minho's supporters already showing signs of uncertainty. Every word she spoke was calculated, Adana continued, her eyes scanning the room, locking onto those who seemed to doubt her. "Do you really think someone like her would reveal her intentions without knowing exactly how it would play out? Every leader before her was silent for fear of what their words might unleash. But Seojin spoke because she knew that true strength doesn't lie in keeping quiet. It lies in knowing when to break the silence, to take control of the narrative." She turned slowly, addressing Minho directly now. His eyes, cold and calculating, met hers, but there was a flicker of something else. Perhaps doubt, or perhaps just the realization that this wasn't going as he had planned. "Minho," Adana said, her voice sharper now. "You think silence is power, but you've misunderstood it. Silence born of fear leaves you vulnerable. It opens the door to others. But silence born of strength, that leaves no room for doubt." Seojin didn't speak out of weakness. She spoke because she had nothing to hide. The moment she chose to speak, she became invincible. The room shifted again. Some of the faces that had been set in defiance softened, and the flicker of uncertainty spread like wildfire. Even Minho's followers seemed to hesitate, the certainty in Adana's voice cutting through the very foundations of his argument. Adana didn't wait for Minho to respond. She knew better than to give him the chance. She had already turned the tide. The syndicate had gathered here with a choice, whether to follow someone who could make decisions in the shadows, or someone who was brave enough to stand in the light, unapologetically. "Seojin's leadership is one of power," Adana said, her voice ringing clear in the still air. "She knows that to lead, you must first master the art of silence, and then, when the time is right, speak with the weight of 1,000 decisions behind you, and that is what will make her the greatest leader this syndicate has ever seen." There was no applause, no cheers, just a deep, undeniable shift in the room. Minho's grip on the room was slipping, and Seojin's quiet strength, her choice to speak, had turned the tide. The days that followed the decision to rebuild were quiet ones, at least on the surface. There were no grand proclamations or sudden shifts in the world outside their doors, no dramatic speeches to signal the beginning of a new era. Yet, within the walls of their shared penthouse, something was changing. Seojin's empire, built on shadows and whispers, was taking a new shape, and at the center of it all was Adana, no longer just his partner in the shadows, but his equal, his mirror, his anchor. His silence, once a weapon, had become a refuge. The world he had created, one of calculated moves and soft-spoken commands, had been enough to keep the empire in motion. But now, he knew it couldn't remain so. Not for him, not for them, not when the empire needed to evolve, to thrive in ways that went beyond the fragile networks of power that had kept it afloat. He would speak again, but only when it mattered. And when he did, they would listen. In the early days of their new life, Seojin's words were few. He didn't need to speak much. Adana understood him, his intentions, his silence, and the subtle shifts of his mind. Their connection was one that ran deeper than language. It was a language of its own, formed through glances, gestures, and shared moments. Yet there was something missing, something Seojin couldn't ignore. His voice, the one part of himself that had always been locked away, the one thing he had withheld for so long. When he spoke to others, it was with purpose. His commands were sharper now, more deliberate. The old confidence, quiet but commanding, remained, and in that stillness, people felt the weight of his presence. But with Adana, things were different. She was no longer just a shadow to follow, an observer. She was his partner, his true counterpart, and the words that had once seemed impossible now hung in the air between them, like unspoken promises. There were moments, late at night, when the city below them hummed with life, its lights flickering in rhythm to the heartbeat of soul, that Seojin found himself trying to speak. The apartment, high above the city, was their sanctuary, a place where the world's noise fell away. Adana would be beside him, her presence solid and unwavering. He would turn toward her, words bubbling up in his throat, unsure, awkward in their delivery. But he pushed through, determined to give her something that had always been denied. His past, his truth, the stories he had never shared. "It wasn't always like this," he said one night, his voice hoarse, as though the act of speaking itself was a muscle he hadn't used in too long. Adana, always patient, didn't rush him. She let him take his time, letting the words form and the silence between them stretch and breathe. He paused, and she waited, as always, her eyes never leaving his. His mind sifted through the years, the days before his silence had defined him, before the empire had swallowed everything whole. "I used to be," he faltered, then shook his head. "I don't know. Just a mess. I never knew what I was doing. People only listened to me because they thought I had answers. But I didn't. I was always just hoping I didn't fail." Adana's gaze softened, but she didn't interrupt. She let him speak, letting him pick apart the parts of himself he had buried so deeply. "I wasn't always sure, about any of this. About the power, the control. It was all just a way to protect myself, to hide behind." Seojin's hands shook slightly as he spoke. It was like unwrapping a part of himself he'd kept under lock and key, and for the first time, it felt raw. He didn't know how to explain the vulnerability in it all, but Adana, his partner, his strength, made him feel like it was okay. She was the only one who could make him believe that. I think I built the empire because I was afraid of being nothing," he said quietly, his voice nearly drowned by the sound of the city below. He glanced at her then, eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, all the years of silence seemed to disappear. She had always known him in this way, but hearing the words from his lips, finally, after all these years, felt like something new. Adana remained silent, her expression soft, her understanding of him deeper than he could ever put into words. She was the only person who had ever truly seen the man behind the silence, the one who wasn't just a symbol of power, but a man with flaws, with fears. "I've never been this uncertain," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But with you, I think I'm finally starting to understand what it means to be more than just the quiet leader. I don't want to hide anymore." His words were slow, clumsy even, but they held weight, more than any calculated speech ever had. For once, Seojin wasn't afraid to be less than perfect. He was just a man, with a past he couldn't change and a future he was finally building, piece by piece, with his voice. And as the silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, Adana simply nodded, her fingers brushing his in a gesture that spoke volumes. For the first time in years, Seojin didn't need to be anything other than himself. And in that, he found the strength to keep speaking, however awkward, however halting. In the quiet of their penthouse, with the city sprawling beneath them like a million forgotten dreams, Seojin spoke of his past, and Adana listened. She didn't rush him, didn't force the words to come faster. She let him build the future, one word at a time, knowing that this was only the beginning. As the final words spilled from Seojin's lips, you couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. The silence that had once held him captive was finally breaking, and in its place, a new future was being shaped, piece by piece. If you felt that same struggle, the pull between who you were and who you're becoming, then this is just the beginning. So here's the deal. If you're ready to see the rest of Seojin's journey, if you want to witness more of this transformation, because let's be real, this story is only getting started, then hit that subscribe button now. Like this post if you're ready to face your own silences and break free from whatever's been holding you back. And don't forget to comment below. Where are you watching from? I read every single one. So, if you're ready to get hooked, to dive into this world of power, vulnerability, and truth, then stay with me. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. See you in the next one.